The audience globally is more attuned to want to listen to Hamas. Does that have something to do with the fact that we've got this sort of culture of oppressor versus oppressed? And right, Hamas is putting themselves out there as the oppressed, and the global world right now thinks that oppressed people are the ones that need support. Of course, that's how we all got raised. That's what the freaking special forces, the Green Berets, their motto is liberate the oppressed. That's what they live for. What we don't realize is that sometimes the oppressed are Nazis. Sometimes the oppressed are extremists that actually should be oppressed.
There's these two questions that have obvious answers, and yet those obvious answers completely contradict one another in terms of how they get applied practically. One is, does the Israeli government have a right and responsibility to defend its own people and to retaliate when they're attacked? Of course. That's just an obvious, it's almost a non sequitur. Of course they do. Should the Palestinians just sort of accept that they lost their homeland and that's that? Or do they have a right to resist? All of these stories that most Americans don't know, that most Israeli kids don't learn about. Every single Palestinian knows all of these stories and all the rest, right? And so they would look at and be like, this guy, the butcher of Beirut, you elected him prime minister. And so, yeah, there's videos of Palestinians cheering after an Israeli attack. You elected this terrorist as your prime minister. And so how is that not the same thing? Is that a similar thing? Do one or neither or both of those perspectives have any validity?
Behind all the cultural artifacts that color who we are, at base, we're just human, and we can all understand each other on that human level. We all have the need for love. We all feel the emotions of selfishness. We all feel jealousy. We have all of these things in common that are the foundation through which every cultural belief and every source of identity that we adhere to or subscribe to are built from. I just want to implore any listener out there to join me in my effort to be as practical as possible while thinking about this topic, and to try to see things from the most human dimension possible, irrespective of the politics and the intense and heightened emotions that shrouds this whole issue.
In my assessment right now, the people that are winning the information operations is Hamas, and the people that are losing information operations is Israel. When you see, and for people that don't know what information operations, it's probably, I don't know, I don't have the military definition on hand, but it's like the all-encompassing, how are we telling the story? How are we getting our story out there? How are we propagating what's happening and propagandizing what's happening? And how are we making people understand the predicament that we're in and how we're handling it? And right now, in my assessment, Israel is not winning that information operation. And one of the
things, is amazing when you think about it, after what just happened.
Yep.
The extreme nature of this attack by Hamas, that already Israel is struggling to maintain control of the narrative, especially outside the United States. The United States is always more pro-Israel than the Europeans, let alone the rest of the world. But even here, compared to previous wars and conflicts and attacks, it's turning faster than it has in the past.
It's kind of crazy to think that. It's kind of crazy to think that Hamas is winning the information operations, the information campaign. It's crazy to think that they just went and attacked Israel and murdered and killed and raped. And in a week, people are, like you said, butting that, and Hamas is winning the information. That's a shock.
It's always good to have a healthy dose of skepticism when thinking about military or just political affairs, and Israel is no exception to this. There are countless examples of countries using their propaganda machine to mislead the public both internally and externally about what they're actually doing. In spite of that, we can't just dismiss the public-facing side of these systems, for one, because it's all we have to work with, and two, because the propaganda itself tells us something, a lot, I would argue, about the ideals of that country. A government wouldn't lie about invading another country to free those people and to disarm weapons of mass destruction if those don't have something to do with the ideals of that country. To the extent that those ideals aren't met, it's more often a consequence of the corruption of those in power. I know, shocker, people in power can be corrupt. It's more often that than it is a representation of the principles and ethos that a country aspires to. This is the lens through which I view Israel and Hamas. And I say Hamas specifically because I think it's appropriate to make a distinction between Hamas and the Palestinians.
I liked out of the gate that there was some sort of differentiation between Hamas and Palestine. Hamas did a great job of making Hamas Palestinian. They are the Palestinian cause, as opposing to be a freaking terrorist cause. Because you've got to think a normal Palestinian person that's been living in Gaza is like, bro, you know what I want? A freaking job and water. That's what I want. I want my family, I want my kids to go to school. And to set them up, Hamas has done a great job of setting themselves up as the Palestinians.
One of the reasons that they tend to win the information ops battle is, in a way, they have an easier job, right? In the sense that Hamas, if world opinion turns against Hamas, that's actually fine. They're not really in any worse of a situation than they were before that. As long as the intensity of emotions and hatred and everything goes up to prevent any fatal compromises that are going to subvert their maximal gain, then that's good. As long as the level of intense emotions goes up. And that is easier to do. What you said too about, the ones who may be oppressed, you can step back and look at this from a historical perspective and say, no doubt these people are oppressed. That does not, as much as we always sort of have interpreted that way, that does not make them the good guys.
For all we might say about Palestinians electing Hamas into power, I don't think Hamas represents the people in a categorical way any more than Donald Trump or Joe Biden in the U.S. represents, the U.S. in a categorical way. There might be a good amount of the population that got them into power, but that's a far cry, as we all know, from saying that the policies of any particular government are the guiding principles of a country. For one, those elected to power often change their tune about what it is that they said they were going to do. I don't think Hamas did that, but in a country like Palestine, where the checks and balances seem loose at best, it's hard to tell how much the goals of this military group actually represents the broad population, but I, for one, am very skeptical that the goals of Hamas are actually aligned with that of the broader public. If a country as developed as the United States, with all the abundant checks and balances that we have to try to keep the government running, is still capable of having a government that doesn't align with a good portion of the population, then how much more a country like Palestine, which is barely able to decide which government is actually in power? In this sense, it's one thing to condemn Hamas. It's quite another thing to condemn the Palestinian people. Oftentimes people point to the riots in Palestine and how carelessly they treat people's lives who get caught in the middle of those riots, and use that as a justification for why the citizenry is just as corrupt as the government. But looking at our own country, assuming you're here in the US or anywhere in the West, you know that there are a lot of riots which don't really represent even the minority view in the country. It's also quite difficult for me to see how a group like Hamas, using their own people as human shields, could possibly be aligned with the interest of those people. Again, comparing it to the West, in the spirit of that human perspective that I talked about in the beginning, we just need to look at what our government is doing and the opposition within the country to that. And imagine our government, in addition to using us as human shields, also causing our neighbors to react in such a way that kills so many of us. How would we feel about that government? I really doubt most of us would be fond of that government, even if there's an outspoken minority out there that actually supports that government and is trying to promote that agenda out in the streets somewhere. Another way in which the goals of Hamas easily diverges from that of the regular Palestinian is in the possibility of a two-state solution. Ironically, this aligns Hamas more with the Netanyahu administration, who has also made it clear that he is not in favor of a two-state solution. This is probably the main reason why some have theorized that Netanyahu is in cahoots with Hamas, a claim that doesn't really seem to have a lot of evidence to back it up that I've seen. While I'm sure it's very interesting to consider why Netanyahu would be prioritizing the sabotage of a two-state solution more than he would be prioritizing the Jewish lives that would be lost by enabling Hamas, and also the peace deals that he's actually trying to strike with these Arab countries when the October 7th attack happened, I think it's just a conspiracy theory at best. Nonetheless, it's a very interesting alignment between Hamas and the Netanyahu administration. Or more interestingly, it's a misalignment between the Netanyahu administration and very likely a good amount of the Israeli people. And also a misalignment between Hamas and a good amount of the Palestinian people whose freedoms Hamas is supposedly fighting for.
Hamas, as an opponent of the two-state solution, is an unsavory ally of people like Netanyahu. Not saying they support these people or they're sending them weapons or anything like that, but, Benjamin Netanyahu to the Israeli Knesset, a quote from him, he said, "Anyone who wants to thwart the establishment of a Palestinian state has to support bolstering Hamas and transferring money to Hamas. This is part of our strategy to isolate the Palestinians in Gaza from the Palestinians in the West Bank. It's impossible to reach an agreement with them. Everyone knows this." And he's talking about Hamas here, but we control the height of the flame. This is the way a lot of the people around Netanyahu look at Hamas. And others who are critical of Hamas, are critical of Netanyahu, like Ehud Barak, have criticized the Netanyahu faction for this position.
It's much more easier for me to condemn Hamas, a group that founded itself on the premise that it was going to eradicate the Jews from that region, from the river to the sea, than it is for me to condemn Palestinians, who, like any other citizenry, has the goals of taking care of their family, loving their kids, taking their kids to school for an education. And speaking of propaganda, we can consider how effective it can be at brainwashing a population. We only need to look at Japan in World War II or North Korea right now, but it's really hard to imagine that level of brainwash for a part of the world that has been heavily influenced by outside intervention for all of recent history. Add social media to that and the inevitable intermingling between Israelis and Palestinians, and it's very difficult to imagine that most Palestinians are anti-Semites or want anything less than to just live peaceful lives.
You know, like that's one thing Nietzsche had right. Yes, power can corrupt, but weakness and continual defeat can corrupt the soul as surely as anything. And that is something that I mean, there's no doubt that it's happened in Gaza to a large degree. It's not as bad in the West Bank, but there have been independent journalists and stuff who've gone and taken polls of Palestinian schools and classrooms, little 12-year-old, 10-year-olds, and asked them, what do you want to do when you grow up? And something like 65 or 70% say, I want to be a martyr. And it's like, you know, well, everybody wants to climb the status ladder in their particular society. And in the context of that society, things have warped so much that that is what kids aspire to. And it's like you said, that's a generational solution, if there's any solution.
If there is a solution.
I could be wrong about the larger public sentiment in Palestine. It's hard not to have a little bit of doubt when you have a kid calling his parents in Palestine to brag about how many Jews he had killed during the October 7th attack. But then again, such fringe examples do not seem to carry enough weight to condemn the entire population of Palestine any more than some activity of the KKK or an anti-fascist group in the US can be used to categorize the entire population or even a sizable minority of people in the US.
You know, some people don't like a question like this. Other people were more thoughtful about it, which is, you know, it's a reasonable question to ask whether a stateless refugee population confined to an area ringed by a wall that is patrolled by remote-controlled machine gun robots, which Gaza is, whether the people in there can ever actually really, in broad sense, be the aggressors against the state that put them there and keeps them there. Like, that's not an unreasonable question, in my opinion. Now, you know, that doesn't really, it wouldn't affect my decision-making process if I was the Israeli prime minister. You know, you have an obligation to protect and retaliate if you can't protect your people. But if you look back at, like, the United States during the frontier days, you know, there were Indian attacks, Indian raids. They killed whole families. They mutilated corpses, all these terrible things. And those things were used to justify continued expansion and retaliation by the United States. But like if today the American Indian movement started bombing, you know, shopping malls and stuff, everybody would look at that very differently than they look at Crazy Horse or somebody attacking back in the 1800s. That's them resisting the loss. I mean, we see what became of the Native Americans. They're resisting that. Nobody would really begrudge them, you know, their right to resist that. Palestinians, it's such a unique case because, you know, this is something that has been going on for really about 100, 110 years now. Israel's been around since 48. And normally when, you know, you have a successful colonization project like Israel did, and you push a lot of the people who lived in that territory out to the periphery, outside the borders of your state, that's sort of the end of the matter. Maybe a generation or two goes by and the people who lost their homes or whatever are not around anymore. And it becomes a question for historical debate rather than a policy debate. And the Palestinians have never stopped fighting, never stopped resisting, partly because of the Arab states and the support and encouragement that they've given them. And so this is something that is really a relic of an earlier historical period that has persisted into the present day.
I don't want to spend too much time making points for why I think Hamas should be condemned, because all the points that I've heard as to why Hamas is a legitimate group of people really don't hold any weight whatsoever. It's usually people denying that what happened on October 7th actually happened, or saying that somehow that was perpetuated by the Israeli government itself, or saying that while it did happen, it was somehow justified. While there's always a small chance that some of these theories might end up being true, that's really all they are at the moment, is just theories, and some of them are just conspiracy theories at best, with no substantiation that I've seen so far to back them up. I am more than happy to be pointed in the direction of any reference that actually substantiates that Hamas is not a terrorist group, or that they did not actually carry out the October 7th attack. Now hold on a second. Before you break your keyboard trying to type, here's another person who thinks October 7th started this whole war. No, I do not. And you're right. I'm sure Israel too has perpetuated its own gratuitous violence and suffering upon citizens who had nothing to do with the war whatsoever, but for being at the wrong place at the wrong time. And not just historically, but I'm sure presently, I would be shocked if there aren't pockets of the Israeli military or even just overzealous civilians who have taken it upon themselves to use this war as a pretext to commit heinous crimes. This is war, after all, in spite of how unfortunate and unjustifiable those might be.
People have looked at these videos that have come out of people in Gaza, people on the street, celebrating around the corpse of an Israeli woman. There was one being paraded around. There's videos like of after Israeli attacks just in the past of Palestinians celebrating on the street. And people point to that as a sort of justification for a sense of collective responsibility on these people. They voted in Hamas. They cheer on these attacks. They might not have carried them out, but there's no reason that we should be real squeamish about any attacks that happen to kill those people, because look at them. They're celebrating these attacks. The other side's argument, they would look and say, okay, back in 1948, as the war was going on, there was a group called the Stern Gang. Lehi, they called it in Hebrew. This was a straight-up terrorist organization that sent mail bombs to British officials in London, may have sent mail bombs to Harry Truman, a hardcore group of people. They planted bombs in marketplaces that massacred hundreds of Palestinians. In 1948, a group of them went into a village called Deir Yassin and massacred everybody there. It was a My Lai massacre kind of thing. All the men were gone. All the military-age men were gone because they were involved in the fighting somewhere, and they just came and massacred all the women and children. And this is something that Israeli historians have written about, and it's not really controversial anymore about what happened. It was a My Lai-style massacre that was carried out by this group, the Stern Gang, or Lehi. Well, Lehi is still a recognized medal in the Israeli Defense Forces. So is Irgun, which is another major terrorist organization, Zionist terrorist organization that existed back then. The leader of that group, when the Deir Yassin massacre was carried out in 1948, was Yitzhak Shamir, who was later elected prime minister of Israel. The leader of Irgun, the other terrorist organization that killed huge numbers of civilians, killed a lot of British personnel as well, including carrying out the King David Hotel bombing, which is where the British used as their headquarters. The leader of that group was Menachem Begin. He was later elected Israeli prime minister. You take a guy like Ariel Sharon, who, all hyperbole aside, I mean, Ariel Sharon is like a real deal 20th century war criminal. And there's a lot of Israeli high officials, including military people who were in the government with him who think that. You go back to like 1981. The Israeli defense minister, Ben-Gal, was being accused by some of his own high officials of in signing off on killings of civilians. And so he got run out of office. And Menachem Begin was prime minister at the time. And so he replaces the defense minister with Ariel Sharon. And right away, Ariel Sharon wanted to go to war with Lebanon. That's what he wanted to happen. Because that's where after 1970, that's where most of the Palestinian leadership was. He's literally working with IDF Northern Command and special operations groups up there, where they killed hundreds of civilians with car bombs, donkey bombs, other IEDs that they placed around that were built in Israeli special operations headquarters, or not the central headquarters in Tel Aviv, but up there in Northern Command. They were building these bombs, getting locals to, paying them to go plant them in areas with the specific goal. And again, there's enough high Israeli officials and military officials from that time who are critical of what Sharon was doing that we've kind of got the full story on it now, that his goal was to ignite a civil war between the Lebanese Christians, the Shiites, and the Palestinians. And so he would bomb the Shiites and the Christians to try to make it look like it was the Palestinians. He would bomb Palestinians, try to make it look like it was the Shiites or the Christians to get them going. And I mean, one car bomb killed 83 civilians, wounded another 300. A lot of the people who were killed were women who worked in a clothing factory that all burned to death. And there were hundreds and hundreds, minimum hundreds of people who were killed in these straightforward terrorist attacks, right? He gets his way, though. They do invade Lebanon after some things kick off. As the Lebanese war is progressing, Sharon is just straight up lying to Begin, the prime minister, and the rest of the government. He's like, okay, yeah, all I'm doing, establishing a security perimeter right here in like this little part of southern Lebanon. We just got to push these people out because they're launching, rockets or mortars at our troops. We're gonna do that. And he would push out past that. And he'd say, well, now we have to, it was just a mission creep, but it was done very consciously. And so that they went all the way up to Beirut. When they were in control of Beirut, there's the famous massacres that took place at Sabra and Shatila, which are two Palestinian refugee camps where the Israeli Defense Forces were in control of the area. And one of the Christian militias in Lebanon that they were allied to went in there under the watch. And we know now, with the knowledge of a lot of the people, they didn't know exactly what was going to happen, but they knew there was going to be a massacre. And they let them go in and they killed 1,000, maybe 1,500 Palestinian civilians. Women and children, massacred them, cut them up, mutilated them. It was a horrible war crime. So that happens. They call Ariel Sharon the butcher of Beirut. Every Palestinian calls him that. All of these stories that most Americans don't know, that most Israeli kids don't learn about. Every single Palestinian knows all of these stories and all the rest, right? And so they would look at it and be like, this guy, the butcher of Beirut, you elected him prime minister. And so, yeah, there's videos of Palestinians cheering after an Israeli attack. You elected this terrorist as your prime minister. And so how is that not the same thing? Is that a similar thing? Do one or neither or both of those perspectives have any validity?
If there's one thing that can really push the boundary of what is thought justifiable, I think it's war. But how far back exactly do we go when trying to figure out solutions for current situations? Can we say that the Nazis were justified because the Germans got the short end of the stick after World War I? And so it was fine for them to do what they did during World War II as a reaction to how they were treated? I think not.
The cycle of violence began at a time, and I kind of touched on this earlier, but it began at a time when the world was very different than it is now. 1948, that's right after, 1948 is when the Zionist forces drove 700 to 800,000 Palestinians out of their towns and villages, pushed them out into these refugee camps where they've been sitting ever since. Massive atrocity. If that were to happen today, we would look at that as something that's totally unacceptable. This was 3 years after the Second World War. You had the Germans and Japanese, just mass violence against civilian populations. We were flattening Japanese and German cities like it was just going out of style. We had the Soviet Union was legitimized by the Allies to the point that these Soviet butchers, literally individual Soviets who had tens of thousands, had their signature on tens of thousands of murders, literally signed the papers, sat in judgment of war crimes at Nuremberg. And so, and in 1948, they were still in the process of just mass violence on an extreme level in Eastern Europe as they conquered and consolidated their control over Eastern Europe. That's what's going on in the world. In the 1950s, we killed something like 20% of the entire population of North Korea. A lot of it with heavy bombers against an enemy that didn't really have an air force of its own. So, this is the world at the time. This is how the world operates. And so, in that context, 4 or 5 million Germans in Czechoslovakia and Poland and other places all got ethnically cleansed and sent packing back to Germany. The reason this is the way it is that it's the longest running one. It's this callback to this earlier kind of barbaric primitive age when we were all, every country, even the good countries, were just massacring each other's civilians in war. And this one has just carried on that cycle of violence because after the Second World War, with the creation of the United Nations, with the Cold War considerations, the propaganda considerations of the Cold War, it became impossible for anybody, Israel in this case, to actually complete the job. If the Israelis had moved into Palestine in 1890 instead of, say, 1888 instead of 1948 and done the same exact thing that they had done in 1948 and 1888, none of this would be an issue. This would be something that they did at a time when that was totally normal to do. But they did this sort of, again, the UN existed. It was post-World War II. We had to worry about the Soviets saying, that the US is supporting this colonization project, in the Middle East. This whole conflict, it started in the old world, but it's taken place almost entirely in the new world where none of those things are really allowed to happen anymore.
At some point, we have to draw the line and leave history as a context while we try to address present issues with present solutions, as opposed to clinging onto it as some sort of a reactionary justification for the heinous crimes that only exacerbate an already intractable problem. A lot of pro-Palestinians commented in my previous video by pointing at a lot of the atrocities that happened while the Jews were being resettled into modern-day Israel. And there's this question that has still not been answered by any of them, which is, what do you propose Israel or the Jews in that region do? Obviously, we're not going to have 10 million Jews pack up their bags and move out. So when that's the only option, when that and death is the only option, I'm genuinely curious, what do you think is the right solution? Do those impossible options really not matter? Or do we really think that if Israel were to drop all their weapons, lift all the restrictions and the blockades in the area, that Hamas would be happy to live side by side with the Jews? And if not, what do you think is the solution, given that war in an urban environment with the modern technology we're playing with is commensurate with the amount of civilian casualties that we've seen? Moreover, why do you think there's such a passionate selective outrage against Israel when it comes to the Palestinians as compared to Muslims who are being persecuted in so many other countries, most notably China, Myanmar, India? For all those millions of minority Muslims who are being persecuted in other parts of the world, are we organizing any protests for them anytime soon?